So tomato soup. Tomato soup. You know how hard it is to find a picture of just plain tomato soup? It's very hard. But tomato soup either in a mug so that it can be drunk, or in a bowl maybe with some crackers, but that's about it. Just tomato soup. When I get sick, it seems like all I feel like eating, if anything, if I'm going to eat anything, it's only tomato soup. And I have to be sick for quite a while before I get tired of eating tomato soup. Do you want to eat anything? Oh, maybe some tomato soup would be nice. That's how it is for me. For Mark, one of my friends, who was my neighbor, my friend in high school, for him, I remember, I don't know why, I guess we had this discussion one day, for him, it was apple juice. Apple juice. When he got sick, give him a glass and give him a can. Are you old enough to remember the cans? It's hard to find these pictures too. No plastic formulated bottle with a handy handle. And no, in those days you had to figure out how to get into that can. This is not a little can, this is a can of apple juice. That's what he wanted. That's about all he wanted. He was sick, give him apple juice. He'll be okay. I don't like being sick. And as far as I know, I've never met anyone else who likes being sick. But those of us who only get sick once in a while, we really should count our blessings, because there are many people who suffer with various types of chronic illnesses and pains. There are those who must battle the effects of a disease. And there are people who feel sick a lot of the time or all of the time, but no one seems to be able to diagnose what it is that's causing that, why exactly they feel that way. So we probably all get sick sometimes. If we just get sick once in a while, we should be thankful. But being sick, whether it's once in a while or most of the time, is definitely no fun, right? When I'm sick, I don't know how it is for you, but if I'm really sick, eventually I get so tired of being in bed, I'm like, I gotta get up and do something. And what I mostly do is I stagger over to the couch or the chair and I wrap up in a blanket and I flop down again. And I need to rest. And food doesn't even seem particularly appealing to me, which is not my default mode, except for maybe a little bit of tomato soup. And I don't know how it is for you, but when I'm sick, I sit there and I think about all of the things I should be doing and the things I need to get done, and I think about how far behind in life's schedule I'm getting, and it just makes me feel worse. And I don't know how it is for you, but when I'm sick, there's definitely no place to be like home, right? When you're sick, you want to be where there are people who will help care for you, people who will sympathize with you in your suffering. I'm male, I need sympathy and support when I'm suffering with sickness. Now, of course, there's certainly a time, there's a certain level of illness where the hospital is the best place where you should be, not at home. But outside of that, if I'm sick, I want to be home. I remember being sick a couple of times when I was at college at what is now Burman University in Alberta. You get the flu or something, and man, it's hard because you'd like to be home, but home is here, 3 provinces away. Fortunately for me, I had this girlfriend named Sandra. It's okay, Sandra. And her family's home happened to be right on the campus, which was nice. And our college dorm dean was nice. And if I was really sick, he'd say, okay, you can go stay with them until you get better. And it was nice to be able to go somewhere sort of like home and be able to try to recuperate and let her family sympathize with me. The only thing worse, I think, than being sick is being sick and left to take care of yourself. That's really bad. Now, with all of that, let me interject kind of abruptly right here with a question that I'd like to invite you to start thinking about. The question is this: how caring is your church, is our church? And I'm not asking so much here about, our whole denomination as a worldwide entity. I'm talking about our local congregation. How caring are we to one another, our fellow church members, right here in our setting here at Willowdale? And if you're willing to consider that question, which I hope you are, then I think to help keep things in a proper perspective, there's another question that kind of naturally should go along with it. And the second question is this: how caring are you? Or if you're talking to yourself, you should say, how caring am I? Two questions to think about. Because he was sick. I mean, like gravely ill. In fact, it looked like he might not even make it. He might not survive. And what was even worse is he was far, far away from his home, far away from his family at the time. There was no rapid means of communicating with them on his condition. Like, you couldn't text or something like that. And he's only mentioned in one book in the Bible. I don't know if he's anybody's favorite Bible character, but he's only mentioned this one book, which was the letter that he carried back to his home church from the imprisoned apostle Paul. So I don't know if you know who I'm talking about, but I invite you to open a Bible and get one in your hands if you've got it there, and go to Philippians chapter 2, where we find his story. The only place in the Bible we find his story. Philippians chapter 2, and it's in the last part of the chapter. I want to start reading at verse 25 through to the end of the chapter. And this is where we get a little spotlight on this Bible character. Philippians chapter 2, beginning at verse 25. So Paul is writing to the Christians in the congregation there in Philippi. And Paul writes, "Yet I considered it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus." How many of you have Epaphroditus as your favorite Bible character? Maybe not so much. "I considered it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother, fellow worker, and fellow soldier, but your messenger and the one who ministered to my need, since he was longing for you all and was distressed because you had heard that he was sick. For indeed he was sick, almost unto death. But God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. Therefore, I sent him the more eagerly, that when you see him again, you may rejoice, and I may be less sorrowful. Receive him therefore in the Lord with all gladness, and hold such men in esteem, because for the work of Christ he came close to death, not regarding his life, to supply what was lacking in your service toward me." All right, so let's just review what is happening here, what's going on. Paul, at this point, is in custody in Rome. And the Christians in the city of Philippi, as they had done on previous occasions, they put together a gift of aid to send to Paul. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us what exactly that gift contained. Maybe they were sending him food, maybe they were sending him clothing, maybe they were sending him money, maybe all of the above, I don't know. But when it was all packed up and ready to go, one of the members of their congregation, this man named Epaphroditus, he was the one commissioned to make the trip from Philippi, which is located in Macedonia, which in today modern times would be like in northern Greece. He made the trip all the way from Philippi all the way over to Rome in Italy to personally deliver this generous gift from the church family there. And it seems that once he got there, Epaphroditus stayed with Paul for a while to help him and the Christian cause and what was happening there in Rome. But then his return to Philippi was delayed because he became seriously sick. And we're not given any details about his symptoms. We don't know what caused his illness. We don't know what exactly was going on. All we know is that it was really bad. His survival, his very survival was in question. They didn't even know if he was going to make it, if he was going to live. So now that Epaphroditus is well again, Paul is now sending him home with this letter for his home church. But what I would like us to take note of from this story, there's a whole bunch of stuff we could grab from this story, but I would like us today to think about the reason why Epaphroditus was so anxious to get back home to Philippi. And if you were just quickly to read this, kind of scan through this little passage that we just read, and not look at it too closely, you might get the idea that Epaphroditus really just wanted to get home because he was sick. Oh, I'm home, let me get home. Why are we on that slide? I don't know. Oh, no, I am. I'm in the right place. All right, I'm talking to myself. I'm back with you. There we go. So we might think he just wanted to get home, right? But when you look at it, you see that wasn't really the case. Paul is very clear, in fact, on why he was eager to send Epaphroditus home. And he explains that in verse 26. So look at verse 26 again if you've got it there. Paul is saying, why am I sending Epaphroditus back to you? Since he was longing for you all and was distressed because you had heard that he was sick. This was not just a case of Epaphroditus feeling homesick. Oh, I want to go home. The issue here was the concern that Epaphroditus felt for his church family back at home, back in Philippi. Because apparently someone had taken some news to them saying, hey, guess what? I was over in Rome and I heard that, or I learned that Epaphroditus is sick. He's got some serious illness. And now he was troubled over the fact that his people back at home would be concerned and anxious about his condition. Probably they were wondering, who knows, has he died? We haven't heard from him. We thought he would be back by now. We heard that he was sick. Who knows what's going on? Verse 26 says that Epaphroditus was distressed. And the Greek word that's used there, translated distressed in this verse, is the same word that we find used in Matthew 26:37 and Mark 14:33. It's the word used to describe the condition of Jesus as he was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. This wasn't just like, a little bit of worry. This was distressed. But Epaphroditus' distress was not over his own sickness. It wasn't because of his own health. Rather, his distress was over the worries and concerns of his Christian brothers and sisters back at home. So what we find in this verse and in this little passage, this little story, is really an amazing example of loving care among Christians. Notice that Paul describes Epaphroditus as longing not just for some of the Philippians, but he says for all of them, which means he must have enjoyed a caring relationship with the whole church. Wow, the whole church. I don't know how big his church was. I don't know how it was in Philippi. Did they have little congregations or one big congregation? I don't know, but everybody in his church, he knew that they would be concerned, and he wanted to see them all. Philippians 2:26 reveals that Epaphroditus knew the members of his church family sincerely cared about them. He could count on their care. So when they heard about his sickness, he didn't have to wonder about their reaction. He didn't have to wonder if he was gone and forgotten in their minds. Oh, Epaphroditus is sick? Oh, that's too bad. What's for supper? It wasn't like that. He knew his church family well enough to know that they genuinely cared about him. He knew them well enough to know that they would be concerned over this report they received about his poor health. And I'm sure that included knowing that he could be counting on their prayers on his behalf. So if you look at this situation, we have like a full circle of care. You've got Epaphroditus there who is thinking of how the Philippians were feeling, having heard about his sickness and thinking about how they were concerned about him. And at the same time, you've got the Philippians over here and they're thinking about Epaphroditus and how he was feeling being sick and away from home and how they were concerned for him and they're concerned for him and he's concerned for them. And it just goes around and around. And Paul here in his letter makes a very special note of this care and he commends it. Paul didn't have to write this part of the letter, but I'm glad that he did. And if you think about it in the story, the circle of care actually extends out further than that. Because the Philippians, they had shown their care and concern for Paul and his fellow workers by sending this gift with Epaphroditus in the first place. And likewise, if you were to look a little bit further up in verses 19 and 20, Paul has already written about the sincere care that he and Timothy had for the Philippian believers. So in this whole story, we've got Paul, we've got Timothy, we've got Epaphroditus, we've got the Philippian Christians. We can see in the actions of all of these players in the story a consistently caring Christian community. They could count on being cared for by one another. And from the time that Paul and Silas and Timothy and Luke, from the time that they first had gone there to Philippi and established the Christian church, that Philippian congregation had repeatedly distinguished itself as a special place. I mean, they were an actively caring and loving group. If you were living back in those times and they had to say, why don't you go join a church? The best place you could probably go to would be to Philippi, because they had a really good reputation. But now this is now over a decade later when what we're reading about happens. And this story of Epaphroditus is a prime example of how the Philippian church maintained its caring quality. It wasn't just a church that started out good for 3 months or for 1 year and then fizzled out. These people were consistent. The tone and the style of Paul's letter to the Philippians reveals the special friendship and loving closeness that he shared with them. This was a special congregation who had demonstrated their love. However, this didn't mean that just because the Philippians had been caring towards one another in the past, that they would automatically always just by rote do so in the future. Paul recognized that the devil would probably be working very hard to break down this valuable caring trait among them. And I think that's why he was inspired to write the challenging words of counsel that are recorded a little bit earlier in chapter 2, verses 2 through 4. If you've still got Philippians there, look at what Paul wrote a little bit before this. Back at the beginning of this chapter, chapter 2, verses 2 through 4. Listen to what Paul said to even this really, really good church filled with loving people. Philippians 2, verse 2, Paul wrote, "Fulfill my joy by being like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord, of one mind. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem others better than himself. Let each of you look out not only for his own interests, but also for the interests of others." See, even these Philippians, as nice as they were and as committed as they were, they needed to be reminded of the necessity of maintaining a proper Christian attitude toward one another, an attitude that would protect their mutually caring relationship from being shattered. Even Paul recognized that just because they had a good decade's worth of good track record, didn't mean he could take that for granted. So Epaphroditus and his fellow Philippians have left us a wonderful example, I think, of a caring congregation. But if we read the Bible and look at the stories and look at the principles and stop there, we're not gaining much. There's always a next step that has to happen when we look at the Bible. And that is to then take those principles and ask the question, what about us? What about our church? What about this congregation? What about Willowdale? Because if we just say, oh, isn't that nice? Those Philippians were nice. We can't just stop there. Can we, like Epaphroditus, count on caring? When those who are a part of our fellowship, when they face stuff, when they face health problems, or they face divorce, or they face trouble with their children, or they face financial struggles, or they face grief over the loss of a loved one, they face discouragement for whatever reason, can they count on a caring response to their circumstances? Can they be confident that others will show genuine concern and care for them? Even when people's struggles are at least partly their own fault. Sometimes we have problems because we just do foolish things and make poor decisions. Even then, are we willing to respond to them in a caring, loving, and helpful manner? Those are serious questions. And frankly, they're tough questions. Easy to talk about, but in real life. You see, if our expectation when we think about care within the church is that one person, I don't know, who would that person be? Oh, I know, maybe the pastor. If one person should be able to provide all the care needed by everyone in the church, the fact is, folks, there are going to be many, many disappointed people. Be it a large church or even a very small church. That's the reality. Because I don't know if you've noticed in life, a lot of people have a lot of problems on an ongoing basis. In fact, many of us here have had problems and have problems, right? Okay, I have problems, you don't, good for you. All right? That's the reality. And that means that no one person, no one group of people, well, it's okay, because we have 4 pastors. 3.5 positions, 4 pastors. But no one group of people, no one person. Well, the elders can do that. Well, deaconesses, you know how many deaconesses we have? They can take care of that. Thing is, no one person or group of people, no single group is able to adequately cover the care needs of everyone in the church, even in small churches. And that means that if we think about this, and if we really want to be able to count on one another for genuine loving care, there's only one way that works. And it's the same thing that's true of all of life, is when everyone gets involved. It means that each one of us is intentionally choosing to be a caregiver. It means considering yourself an official member of the church caring team. Did you know that we have a church caring team? We do now. You're on it. In fact, you can think of yourself as one of the caring team leaders. Get yourself a badge if you want, whatever. Say, I'm a caring team leader. Because it's a position you don't have to wait for the nominating committee to ask you to do. One of the few things, right? I'm serious. I mean, you don't have to get a badge, but I mean, I'm serious. It's kind of like we all need to be on the leadership team of the care team. Because, showing care and love and concern for one another isn't just a nice thing for Christians to do. It's not just a fortunate little benefit or bonus for a church to enjoy. Isn't it nice to be part of a church membership? Yes, it is. To be part of a church family. But it's not just a nice little perk. It's actually a Christian requirement. And that's what our scripture reading from 1 Corinthians 12 was talking about, that Darrell read for us. As fellow members of the body of Christ, we are to care for one another so that we share one another's sorrows and we share one another's joys. In Romans 12:10, Paul said the same idea, but he stated it like this. He said, be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love, in honor giving preference to one another. How many of you were alive in the 1980s and want to admit it? Yeah. Do you remember the 80s? If you were in the church, if you were in the Seventh-day Adventist Church at that time, you may or may not remember that back in the 80s, our denomination had a big push, a big promotion, a big focus on the idea that we become known as the caring church. Does anybody remember that? I remember that. It was a big deal. I remember they had you would see big billboard posters and on bus stop signs and everything. We said Seventh-day Adventist Church, the caring church. Now, was that a good idea? Sure, it's a good idea. It's still a great idea. But you know how it is. You have a focus, a theme, a slogan, and then it kind of runs its course. And how many have we had since? I don't know, 10, 20, 50, I don't know. It's still a good idea to be the caring church. But if it's going to have any real meaning, it's got to be more than just a slogan. Because the truth in real life, real-time, day-to-day reality is that we become the caring church only as individual congregations actually develop and demonstrate loving care and concern among their members. That's the only way it works. We can put 1 million posters up, but that doesn't really cut it. And of course, our care needs to extend beyond the church family, but it's pretty hard to care for those outside the church if genuine care is lacking among believers inside the church. So we have 1 Peter 5:7 in the Bible, which tells us that God cares for each one of us. He is the ultimate caregiver. We can always count on him to respond to our feelings and our needs and our concerns in a perfectly caring, a perfectly loving way. Don't have to question what God will do. But if we want to be truly dependable, caring Christians, that means we need to ask God, actually what the Cherubics sang in their first song. We need to ask God to help us to be more and more like him. And then allow the Holy Spirit to transform our thinking and our attitudes, which should then follow with the transformation of our actions. So the ideal goal is a consistently caring community. And if each one of us would determine that with God's help, I'm always getting ahead on these slides, because I think I've had this down, haven't I? Anyways, that's just messing with my brain. The ideal is a consistently caring community. And if each one of us would determine that with God's help, we're going to be caring members of our church family, then we should be able to count on care from one another. But in reality, it's quite possible that not everyone in the church is going to probably today make that serious commitment to caring for fellow believers. We've got, 1,280 some members? Do you think they're all signed up today? How many have left since the service began? Right? In all likelihood, there may be some here today who maybe won't give this matter of how they can contribute to the church being a caring community a second thought once they leave here. Probably some aren't giving it a first thought. Some are too busy finding out what your friend had for supper last night in the nice picture they have of their tomato soup or whatever. So the reality is, not everybody's going to do it. But that should not, their lack of commitment should not discourage you and I into thinking that our own commitment to care won't really make any difference, because it will, and it does. Every single person that engages makes a difference. And the more genuinely caring Christians we have in our congregation, the more care we can count on from one another. What do we mean then when we say, well, let's be caring? What does that mean? Well, you've had an opportunity for a long time to look at my shot of a definition of what I would describe as caring. And that is an attitude towards others which often leads to a specific action on their behalf. To care means to take into your consideration. It means to acknowledge the feelings and the needs and the concerns and the circumstances of someone else, and then, if possible, act to help that person. And that means there is a reality to this. It means that caring for others, it uses up time. It uses up energy. But if we're all sharing in the responsibility of caring for one another in the church, then that means that the demands of caring aren't as great, because the load is shared. It's not all on a few shoulders. I like how Naomi Sullivan Rose described the value of just simple ways of caring in a little poem she wrote called Small Things from the Heart. Here's how it goes. She wrote, "Some things can mean so very much, although they may seem small. A thought, a smile, a friendly touch, or just a telephone call. These thoughtful things can be worthwhile if done with love and care. Someone's concern, always in style, a willingness to share. Although friends may be miles apart and not be face to face, these small things that come from the heart are like a warm embrace. They are a welcome breath of air to help us to withstand the trials and troubles that we bear in this so transient land." And I think perhaps a story told by author and lecturer Leo Buscaglia, who's on the screen. Maybe I think for me that's what best helps illustrate what caring is all about. Because I read about where he was asked to judge a contest, a very unusual contest. They were trying to determine who was the most caring child. What an interesting contest. And in the end, I don't know exactly how they did that or how they figured that out, but in the end, the winner of the contest was this 4-year-old child whose next door neighbor was an elderly gentleman, and his wife had just recently passed away. He had lost his wife. And this little boy, when he saw his neighbor crying, he went over next door. The man was outside in his yard, sitting in a chair, and he was crying. And he went over to the gentleman's yard, and he climbed onto his lap, and he just sat there for quite a long time. And when he finally came back home, his mother asked him, "What did you say to the neighbor?" And the little boy replied this. He said, "Nothing. I just helped him cry." I think what an amazing, beautiful example of active, practical care, right? I just helped him cry. And so as we ponder this matter of how caring our church is and how caring we are individually, there are a couple of points. And I know you're probably thinking, Lord have mercy. He's got a couple of points. Have you looked at the clock, dude? Yes, I have. They won't be too long, don't worry. First point. I think a couple of points is important to think about and keep in focus, right? Because he just say, oh, we should be caring. Okay. But think about it a little bit. The first point is this: to appreciate the care that you do receive. Because the bottom line is we have a choice. Every single one of us has a choice. We can choose to either focus with thankfulness on those who do show us loving care, or we have another choice. We can choose to dwell with resentment on those who didn't show us the care that we thought or wanted or expected or felt entitled to. And I would like to suggest to you that the first option is a far better and beneficial choice. In other words, if each one of us were to probably think more about who we could care for and a little less about who didn't care for us, you know what I think would happen? more of us would be cared for, and there would be more caring going on if we took that attitude. You know, my great-great-aunt lived in the same city. Well, in Oshawa. You know where Oshawa is, most of you? When I was growing up in Oshawa, my great-great-aunt lived there as well. And I actually don't even know what her first name is. I have a guess. I think it's Elizabeth, but I don't know, because all my life we just called her Auntie. That's all I knew as her name, was just Auntie. So she lived there where we lived there growing up in Oshawa, and you know, we would go and visit her at first in her home and later in a senior's residence. We would go visit her quite often, and we would bring her to our home quite often, you know, Sabbath dinner, or, I don't know, Thanksgiving or whatever. We would bring her to our house. We'd go pick her up and take her for Sabbath drives out into the country and stuff like that. And she had some interesting stories from her life that we had all memorized, you know, because she told them to us so many times. And every once in a while, she would surprise us with a new one where we'd be like, whoa, never heard that story before. And we were never really exactly quite sure how old she was, because her stated age, whenever she actually chose to state it, never seemed to match what she stated was her age the last time. So, I mean, even her grandson had no clue how old she was. I don't even know if she knew how old she was. I think she just said her age based on whatever point she was trying to make, or I don't even know what she was thinking, but we had no clue how old she was. 400 years old, I don't know. I don't know how old she was. But she was kind of a neat old lady. And, you know, she survived 3 husbands and several heart attacks before she eventually died from one. From one of the heart attacks, not the husband's. And this lady, like she was feisty. One of the times she had a heart attack, you know, they called the ambulance. They rushed her there to Oshawa General Hospital, and they had her there lying on a stretcher in the emergency department, and they were preparing to admit her to the hospital, and she suddenly decided she was getting up. And she got up off the stretcher. And the horrified medical personnel, they came and asked her what in the world she thought she was trying to do. Like, what are you doing? You're having a heart attack. She's like, no, I'm going home. They're like, you can't go home. You're in serious condition. And they had called her grandson. So at just about that time he arrived, and she informed him in no uncertain terms that she was going home. And he could either drive her home or she could call a taxi. But she was going home. And he knew her, so he drove her home. And she lived on for years, somehow. But you know what? Why am I telling you about her? Because along with the fact that we really did, we visited her quite often. But along with that, my mom called Auntie on the phone pretty well, I mean, every week during all the years we lived there. I mean, there might have been the occasional week, but basically called Auntie up, you know, how are you doing? Every week. And without fail, every single time, year after year, week after week, that my mom would call Auntie, you know, it'd be, hello, Auntie, this is Shirley. This was Auntie's response. Every time. Well, I could be dead and gone and you'd never know it. So she said, every time. You can imagine how good that made my mom feel, you know, glad that she called her up again. Now, actually, there was a variation to her response. Once in a while, she would switch it up a little bit. Once in a while, she would say this. She would say this when you called her. She'd say this when you showed up to visit her. It would either be what I just said, or it would be this one. Well, I shouldn't talk like that. I don't know why I'm saying that, but, well, I could be dead and gone and no one would know about it. So it was either it was just us who was neglecting her, or sometimes it was the whole planet, like everybody, all of humanity. And the thing is this is the ironic thing. We never, ever, in all my memory of all the years visiting Auntie, we never visited her without her receiving at least one phone call during the visit, usually many phone calls. Almost every time we would visit her, we would get there and there was already someone there visiting her and they would just be leaving. Or before we were done visiting, someone else would come to visit her. And you know, the last few years she lived there in the Pioneer, what's it called in Oshawa? Yes, those ones, the seniors' place there. And you know, I even as a kid, I would think like, you know, you'd kind of look at the other apartments and other places, and it didn't seem like there was people coming and going in everybody else's room all the time. But Auntie probably received, if these other people got a quarter of the visits and phone calls and attention that Auntie got, they probably would have been happy. And yet Auntie sadly didn't seem to really appreciate the care that she received. And I think it's sad when I think back about her that instead of for all those years being thankful for all the care and attention that was shown to her, it seems that she just had a singular focus on, the people around her who she felt she was missing out on their care from. What a sad way to live. And perhaps as we think about caring for others, it would be wise to remember that those needing care aren't just those who complain the most and make the most noise, because it's true, right? The squeaky wheel gets the grease. And there are some folks with needs, and they're very comfortable bringing those needs before your face on an ongoing basis. I need help, I need care, and that's not necessarily bad. But I think if we're going to think about care, we need to think about the fact that our care also needs to be shared with the kind of appreciative, quiet folks, right? They need care as well. Second point. Okay, how many were there? 2. There's hope. Second point I would like to call to our attention is that care is strained by conflict. And I think that's where we find this reminder of and call to unity in the first part of Philippians chapter 2. Because the truth is, it's not easy to be naturally caring towards some of the saints. In fact, it's hard to care for people you dislike. It's especially difficult to care for people that you can barely stand. And that's true. Conflict puts a strain on care. And I'm glad that for the most part, people in the church get along. That's nice. But on the other side, sadly, there are too many battles that occur between the saints. Maybe it's in the parking lot, maybe it's in the church basement, maybe it's in the bathrooms, maybe it's in the balcony, maybe it's in the furnace room if you happen to have a key, whatever, wherever they take place. But this reminds us about the value of unity. Did you know that the Philippians had to deal with disagreements? This nice church, this kind of like model church, they had problems. In chapter 4, verse 2, Paul refers to a disagreement between 2 of the ladies there in the Philippian church. It was a big enough deal, he talked about it. And those disagreements are going to happen, right? Even among nice Philippian-type Christians, we're people. And at time to time, we don't see eye to eye. And yet that Philippian church was able to remain a caring church in spite of some disagreements, which is a challenging question for us to think about. Can we care for even those we disagree with? You know what? I've been a person for a number of years. I've been a pastor for quite a few years, a few decades actually. And I grew up in the church. I've always been a part of the church. So throughout, the grand scheme of my life, I've been involved with a lot of different church congregations, and I've been a part of congregations, and I've talked to many other people who have been a part of church congregations all across this country and continent and world. And here's the reality that it is the case in many congregations that there are certain people whose presence can make quite a difference. When such an individual is away, there's just a more relaxed atmosphere and less conflict in the church. Have you ever experienced that? You're like, oh, so-and-so's on vacation. Oh, we can just have a happy Sabbath. So-and-so's on a trip. No, really. Have you ever... And somehow when that individual is present, there's just discord and tension. All those things seem to increase. And so if we're going to individually think about the care that we receive and give, I want to challenge us to think in the broader perspective of our general influence in the church body. When we gather together as Christians, as family of God, as saints, does my influence, does your influence, what does it do? Does it tend to encourage and uplift? Does it bring a sense of peace and love? Or does our influence tend to fuel controversy and uneasiness and disharmony and conflict and criticism? In other words, do I help promote an atmosphere where care can flourish? It's part of the formula. I guess in the end, the question is, are we at least as well off as geese? Geese? There's a lot of good lessons from geese, right? Geese teach us a lot of life lessons, and you probably know some of them. But here's one thing, geese can count on care. Let me explain. When geese are flying there, in their V formations, sometimes something will happen. One of the I didn't clarify this. One of the gooses, one of the geese, one of the birds will get sick or be wounded, or if it's out west, there's a whole bunch of people shooting at them, trying to make pillows and stew out of them. So sometimes they get shot down. And this is what happens with geese as it's being observed. When something happens to one of those birds, the other geese, they will drop out of formation and they will follow that goose who is in trouble down to earth, and they will stay with that goose to try to help it and protect it. And those two geese will stay with the disabled goose until one of two things happens. Either it's good enough to fly again, or it dies. And then what happens is when that happens, there's now either 2 or 3 of them, but whether it's 2 or 3, if the one guy is still alive, then they take off together and they try to join another formation, try to catch up with their original flock. And I can't help take note of this fact when I think about these geese. For all the ornithologists and biologists and whoever spends their life watching geese, I have never heard any one of them observing that the sick goose goes off to the far corner of the pond and pouts because only 2 of the geese in the flock stopped to help me. And the rest of them just kept flying. I guess they don't care about me. They're just going off to warm winter and just leave me here with these 2. Geese, interestingly enough, seem to be willing to appreciate the care that they do receive. Geese are just animals. I mean, how big can their brain be? Look at them. But they act by instinct. And yet, even they can expect and count on care when it's needed. So the question is, how about us? Can we, like Epaphroditus, count on care? We can be sure that we can count on care from God. That part is guaranteed. But can we count on care from our church family? The answer to that question lies with you and me. And we decide what the answer to that question is. So here we are at our closing hymn, number 350, Blessed Be the Tie That Binds. And you know what? We can just sing this hymn together, and that doesn't automatically mean that we'll become a caring community of believers. But I invite you to sing it as a prayer today, a prayer that God will help you and me and us learn more and more to be dependably caring. 350, Blessed Be the Tie That Binds.